Can we first talk about when we actually started seeing the species move into the peninsula in larger numbers?
It's a difficult question to answer, and in large part because it depends on uh, how people reported that information. Explorers reporting that they saw these weird mammals, because these mammals are not around in England or in Europe, so nobody would really know what they looked like or what they, how to describe them. And so we have to go back through early records and try to figure out what people were talking about and then extrapolate from those occasional sightings and even less often reporting of those sightings as to how common they were. And as the article points out, they're very sporadically reported, and sometimes it's unclear whether they're talking about seals or whales or manatees.
Manatees, or the ancestors of manatees, the Sirenians that predate the Florida manatee, were in Florida millions of years ago when the state was underwater. So we do find Sirenian fossils, and native peoples of Florida and early settlers picked up those fossils. But the actual bones of manatees are extremely uncommon on archaeological sites. But we do have one or two examples dating back as far as 5,000 years ago. But they must have been, or it seems likely that they were pretty uncommon in Florida.
And talk about why that is. What changed in the 18th, 19th century when we started seeing more bones, fossils, evidence of them in large numbers, specifically inland into Florida Springs?
First of all, the climate is much warmer than it has been in the past. Part of that is natural climate change. Beginning about 1200 AD and continuing into the 1800s, we were in what's called the Little Ice Age, and we don't know the precise effects. And it was probably not, continuously cold, but there are studies of fossil corals that suggest that winter water temperatures were colder, and there are historical records that suggest it was also colder too. And of course, anthropogenic climate change has started since the 1800s and has warmed the waters as well. So that's been a big factor, we think.
Yeah, it's worth noting that for almost 50 years, manatees were considered an endangered species, and it was only since 2017 that they were put on the threatened list. So their numbers have rebounded remarkably. Something that I found so fascinating about this article was we talked about climate change a little bit and the habits of the migration of manatees. Coal plants on the coastline warming up waters. I mean, I grew up in the Titusville area, and I would go to the Indian River there, and they would all kind of migrate up to the warm water that's being put out by the power plants there. That was a big part of their move into Florida as well. Dave, I'll put that question to you because we saw quite a large population growth into the 1920s and into the industrial era. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And it's it's a couple of factors. One is that so manatees are limited by water temperature during the winter. If it's too cold in the winter, they'll migrate south or just won't survive over winter. And so once those warm water refugia kick in, they have places where they will go and congregate and can survive the cold water over winter or the cold weather over winter. And the second factor is an increase in forage plants. And so they usually, I think, originally would just be feeding on the Florida eelgrass, is what it's commonly known as. But once these invasive plants came through in hydrilla and water hyacinth, manatees love to eat those too. And so when modern Americans came in and sometimes they purposefully planted those plants. And as any typical invasive species, they started invading and they reproduced a lot. So not only did manatees have protection from the cold water, they're these invasive species were able to support larger populations. So I think those two factors coming together as Florida becomes more and more populated and more industrialized lead to this growth in manatee population.
What do you think this research is going to do for the future of managing the species in Florida?
Well, I hope it'll stimulate managers and people who are responsible for um, managing the populations and ensuring their survival. It seems maybe unsupportable in the long term to keep throwing iceberg lettuce into the water, but um, how that occurs is a really tough question, I think. We don't come up with great solutions, I think, in the paper, but that's not really our expertise.
I do think that our research does kind of like raise some questions about subpopulations of manatees, how long they've been around, what the genetic diversity means. So I'm looking forward to this research stimulating more research on the population histories of manatees in finer grained detail.
In media, we like to draw these big conclusions out of science, but I want to be able to answer this question when people ask me or when people see this story. Are manatees native to Florida, and should we be protecting them?
I'd say they're clearly native to Florida. It's just that their numbers are greater now and their habitat has changed so that Florida is a much more inviting place for manatees than it ever was in the past. And that, yes, it's an iconic species for Florida. We should do what we can to protect it and enhance it and keep it around for a long time.
Yeah, I think Dave and I both, I think I can speak for Dave in saying that we also love manatees, and we want to see them protected. And we don't want this research to be used to argue that they can't be sustained in these numbers. Uh, but it's going to take some planning. I like to say it's kind of like, and to a certain extent, it's sort of like a dog or a cat followed us home and had a litter of kittens. I think we feel responsible for them now, and we hope this research can actually, help conserve manatees.